Why did a retired police dog dig up a child's shirt? It started with a silence, a farmer's porch, a dog that didn't bark, and a morning frost cracked by the sound of frantic digging. Arthur Langley didn't expect much when he bought an aging German shepherd at a local auction. He needed a companion, maybe, or maybe just something else alive on the farm besides himself. But the dog ranger had other plans, because on his second morning home he vanished into the edge of the woods. Arthur followed, and what they found buried beneath the brambles wasn't just soil, it was the past. A tattered scrap of a boy's shirt, a name that hadn't been spoken in years, Jonah Reese. This is the story of a dog trained to serve, then forgotten, a boy presumed dead, and a truth that refused to stay buried because one animal never stopped doing his job. The wind came down off the hills that morning like a whisper carrying too many ghosts. Arthur Langley pulled the collar of his canvas coat higher as he stepped out of his truck, gravel crunching beneath his worn boots. The county fairgrounds hadn't changed much in 20 years. Still a patchwork of rusted fences, leaning posts, and weathered men talking too loud over coffee too weak. But it was the first time he'd been there since before the cancer took his wife. Before the house had gone silent, he hadn't come for anything more than a generator belt and a handful of bolts. Livestock auctions weren't his thing, never had been. But when you live alone on a crumbling patch of land where even the weeds had stopped growing, a trip into town felt like the closest thing to noise your life could afford. The auction barn smelled like hay, old sweat, and resignation. The bleachers were half full, mostly with older men in oil-stained ball caps and jackets that knew too many winters. Arthur didn't join them. He drifted along the edge, keeping his hands in his pockets, his gaze fixed ahead, but never looking anyone in the eye. That was when he saw him. Behind the main barn, past a row of aluminum gates and a stack of empty feed bags, a single dog was chained to a splintered post. The coat that once must have gleamed deep sable was now a dull patchwork of grays and scars. His ribs showed, not from recent starvation, but from time. His ears stood erect, but his eyes, clouded and sharp, at once held something Arthur hadn't seen in years. Not fear, not pain. Purpose. There was no barking, no tail wagging, just a quiet, motionless stare that didn't beg and didn't accuse. It simply waited, as if the dog knew Arthur would come. Arthur paused a few feet away. A small white tag swung from a ring on the collar. Lot number 38. "You don't want that one?" came a voice behind him. Arthur turned. A young auction worker, barely more than a boy, leaned against the wall, chewing on a piece of jerky. "He's old," the kid added. "Used to be SAR, or maybe police. No chip, no handler. Nobody claimed him when he aged out. Been shuffled from shelter to shelter for years. Got dumped here last month. If nobody bids, we put him down at noon." Arthur didn't answer. He crouched slowly, careful not to make any sudden moves. The dog didn't flinch, just looked at him. "What's his name?" Arthur asked. The kid shrugged. "Nobody knows. Doesn't bark, doesn't bite either, just sits. Some folks say he's half blind. Others say he's just stubborn." "Or waiting," Arthur said under his breath. The boy gave a short laugh. "Waiting for what?" Arthur didn't reply. He stood up, pulled out his wallet, and without thinking, without planning, peeled a single $20 bill from the worn fold. The auction worker blinked. "That covers the feed cost," the boy said. "He's yours." The boy walked off. Arthur stood there a long moment before crouching again, this time reaching out. "Come on, boy," he murmured. The dog rose slowly, limbs stiff, joints crackling. But there was dignity in the way he stood, like an old soldier refusing to limp. Arthur opened the truck's side door. The dog hesitated only a second before climbing in without help. No noise, no fuss, just silence, shared between two creatures that understood it too well. As Arthur drove down the winding road back to Hollow Valley, he kept stealing glances at the dog through the rearview mirror. The shepherd sat tall despite his frame, staring straight ahead as though memorizing the landscape. The farm, when they arrived, looked as battered as the dog paint peeled from the barn, a tractor that refused to start, and a front porch that creaked even when empty. Arthur parked the truck, got out, and opened the passenger door. The dog jumped down and sniffed the air. Then, to Arthur's quiet astonishment, he limped toward the porch on his own, curled up at the far corner, and settled in like he'd been there all his life. Arthur didn't say anything. He didn't name him. Not yet. Names were for things that stayed. Instead, he stood on the porch and watched the last light fade over the hills, the frost starting to bite at the edges of the earth. The dog didn't make a sound. Neither did Arthur. But for the first time in years, as the wind whispered through the cracked window frames and night wrapped around them, he wasn't completely alone. The road to Hollow Valley wasn't marked by signs or fences, just the slow unraveling of asphalt into dirt, and the way the sky seemed to widen with every mile. Arthur didn't speak as he drove. The cab of the truck rattled with every dip in the road, but the old German shepherd in the passenger seat remained perfectly still. His eyes weren't on Arthur. They weren't on the dashboard either. They stared straight ahead, as if remembering a place the truck hadn't reached yet. No collar jangled, no panting, no shifting weight, just stillness. The farm appeared like a ghost at the edge of the valley peeling white paint, a porch leaning ever so slightly to the left, and a windmill that hadn't spun since Arthur buried Elaine. The gate, half off its hinges, creaked as he nudged it open with the bumper. Fence posts leaned like tired shoulders against cracked earth. The barn sagged under its own memory. Arthur pulled the truck to a stop and let the engine idle for a moment. Then he turned the key. Silence swallowed everything. The dog waited. Arthur opened the door, stepped out, and walked around to the passenger side. The dog's eyes followed him. That was all. "You comin'?" Arthur said. The dog didn't hesitate. He jumped down, not fluidly, not like a young pup, but with the dignity of a creature who had jumped into far more dangerous things. He sniffed the air once, then limped toward the porch like it belonged to him. He chose the far end, near the steps, curled himself into a tight crescent, and let out a single breath. Arthur stood there for a long moment watching. No barking, no tail wag, no plea for attention, just presence. The kind of presence Arthur hadn't felt since Elaine's voice last filled the kitchen. Since the mornings weren't just chores, but shared coffee, shared balance, and shared everything. He went inside. The door stuck for a second before giving in with a groan. The house smelled of dry wood and cold. The fireplace had gone untouched for days. A kettle sat on the stove, dusty. Newspapers lay stacked on the counter, headlines long expired. He put a can of stew on to warm, filled an old ceramic bowl with water, and grabbed a wool blanket from the back of the couch. He opened the screen door and set the bowl beside the shepherd. "You don't gotta drink," he murmured, "but it's there." The dog didn't move. Arthur stood for a moment longer, then laid the blanket just a few inches away from the dog's curled body. Still nothing, not even a flick of an ear. But there was something in the way Ranger's eyes didn't blink, how they followed the stars above, one by one, like counting them mattered. The wind rolled through the valley that night, soft but bitter. Arthur sat on the porch, wrapped in his coat, staring at the nothingness. The dog beside him didn't shiver, didn't flinch. He just breathed. Arthur leaned back against the railing. His hands trembled slightly, not from the cold, but from something he didn't want to name. Maybe it was the presence of another heartbeat nearby. Maybe it was how little effort it took to feel like that mattered. "You're not what I expected," Arthur said. The dog didn't move. "That's all right. I ain't what I used to be either." A gust of wind swept across the porch, and the blanket lifted at the corners. Ranger didn't react. His eyes were closed now, but his ears were still up listening, perhaps, for something only he could hear. Arthur tilted his head toward the sky. The stars were sharp and cold, strung like nails across black velvet. For the first time in years, he noticed how quiet the valley truly was. No engine hum, no coyotes, no distant machinery, just wind and bones and breath. The silence stretched out, comfortable now. And then, almost imperceptibly, the dog shifted. His head moved slightly, and his body inched closer. Not to the food, not to the blanket, but toward Arthur. He stopped just at the edge of the man's boot. Arthur didn't speak again. But in the stillness, in that empty winter night, filled with old wounds and new company, something subtle passed between them. Not trust, not yet, but recognition. Two lives, both frayed at the edges, both quietly refusing to let the world decide they were finished. The porch creaked softly as the wind died down, and side by side, without a word, they sat and kept the dark from feeling too wide. Arthur Langley awoke to stillness, not the comforting kind that comes before sunrise, but a stillness too complete, like a wrong note held too long in a quiet room. He swung his legs over the side of the bed and sat there a moment, listening. No scratch at the door, no click of claws on porch wood. He stood, pulled on his boots, and walked to the front door. The hinges whined as he opened it. Cold air met him first, sharp and dry, pulling at the hem of his flannel shirt, and the porch was empty. The blanket lay rumpled. The ceramic bowl was still half full, rim-crusted with ice. But Ranger was gone. Arthur felt it in his chest before he could form the thought. That strange ache, the one that always came just before something unraveled. "Ranger?" he called, his voice cracking more than expected. No answer. Just the sound of wind moving through brittle grass. He stepped down onto the frost-hardened ground, scanning for any trace, any sign, and there just past the edge of the porch were faint impressions in the dirt. Paw prints, slow and deliberate, heading east toward the tree line. Arthur didn't pause to think. He grabbed his coat, didn't bother with gloves, and followed. The trail led through the back field where the wheat used to grow, long before the drought and the debt and Elaine's final breath. Now It was nothing but dry stalks and cracked earth, rimmed with frost that sparkled under the pale morning sun. The trees at the edge of the property loomed like sentinels, motionless, older than memory. Arthur stepped into their shadows and kept going, boots crunching over the frozen ground. It didn't take long to find him. A few yards in, beneath the thick arch of a broken pine limb, Ranger was clawing at the earth like a dog possessed. Frost flew in flurries, dirt scattered in all directions. His shoulders were tense, breathing ragged, his body half submerged in a hole that grew deeper by the second. "Ranger!" Arthur shouted, heart pounding. "What the hell are you doing?" But the dog didn't stop, didn't even flinch. Arthur crossed the distance in a few fast strides and dropped to one knee. "Easy," he said, grabbing the scruff of the dog's neck. Ranger froze just for a moment and then let out a low, urgent whine. Not fear, not pain. Something else. Arthur looked down into the shallow pit. At first it was just dirt and roots. Then something unnatural. A torn scrap of red fabric. Stained, faded, clinging to the edge of a broken root like a flag caught in a wire fence. Arthur reached in with a gloved hand and pulled it out carefully. His fingers trembled. The fabric was small, child-sized, the kind they made in bright colors, cartoon prints, stitched with a mother's care, the kind Jonah Reese had been wearing the day he disappeared. Arthur sat back, stunned, as the frost nipped at his knees. The boy's name came unbidden, uninvited, but not unfamiliar. He'd known the story. Everyone in Mason County did. 7 years ago, a family camping trip 2 counties over had ended in disaster. A sudden flood, panic. The boy vanished during the night. No body, no remains, just speculation and grief and a dozen broken people. The search had gone on for weeks, helicopters, dogs, volunteers. But it ended like they all do, with silence. But now, this? Arthur looked at Ranger. The dog stood still, chest heaving, eyes fixed on the fabric like it was a buried memory come home to find him. And maybe it was. Maybe that was why he'd stayed quiet all night, why he hadn't touched the food or the blanket. He wasn't resting, he was remembering. Arthur held the cloth tighter, as if afraid the wind might take it away. His breath came slow, clouding the cold air. "Why here?" he whispered. "Why now?" But there was no answer. Just the old shepherd, standing in the dirt, surrounded by pine needles, and the soft, crumbling echo of something that should have never been buried. Something had brought this dog to him. Something that wasn't done yet. Arthur looked down at the paw prints surrounding the hole, carefully placed, no sign of panic or wandering. The dog hadn't stumbled here. He'd led himself straight to it, like a soldier returning to a battlefield, only he remembered. Arthur stood slowly, the cloth still in his hand. He looked at Ranger not as a mutt anymore, not as a stray, but as something else. A guide, a witness, a dog who remembered. The wind picked up again, rustling the trees, and for the first time in years, Arthur Langley felt something stir in his gut. Not fear, not grief, a reason to keep walking. The frost hadn't yet thawed from the forest floor. It clung to the leaves like memory clings to old grief-thin, stubborn, brittle. Arthur knelt at the edge of the shallow hole, the torn red fabric still clenched in one hand, and watched as Ranger went back to work with silent urgency. No growls, no tail wag, only focus. The old shepherd nosed past roots and frozen moss, claws scraping against something more solid than soil. Arthur leaned in just as the dog's paw struck metal. A faint clink. Ranger froze, head tilted, ears forward. Arthur reached in, careful not to disturb too much. Beneath the dirt was a zipper, long rusted, still attached to a strip of shredded nylon, the corner of what had once been a child's backpack. He brushed more dirt aside with stiff fingers. The cold bit at his knuckles. The nylon was blue, or had been once, now stained with mud and age. On it, barely legible beneath years of weather, was a circular cartoon patch, a smiling astronaut. Arthur's breath caught in his throat. His fingers found a small rectangular tag, sewn just beneath the zipper seam plastic laminate, cracked, corners peeling. He wiped it gently with his sleeve. Jonah Reese, grade 2. Arthur sat back, heart thudding. He remembered, everyone had. There were posters stapled to every telephone pole in town that spring bright, hopeful, desperate. That photo of Jonah, gap-toothed and squinting under the sun, had hung in Arthur's own gas station window for nearly a year. He'd watched Jonah's mother grow smaller each time she came in for milk or fuel, always leaving with her hands full and her eyes emptier. Elaine had cried the night the sheriff called off the search. But they all did what people do. They grieved. Then they moved on, all except one, it seemed. Arthur looked down at the dog, dusty, worn, breathing, hard but steady. There was something ancient in Ranger's expression now, not in years, but in weight, as if he'd carried this moment in his bones for too long. "You were there," Arthur said, more to himself than to the animal. "Weren't you?" Ranger didn't look up. He kept digging, slower now, more delicate, until the earth gave way to another corner of the backpack and something beneath it. A small plastic figurine broken at the base. Arthur lifted it gently. It was a toy dog. German Shepherd. Paint long faded. A chill spread from Arthur's spine outward, not the cold, but the weight of realization. This wasn't just forgotten evidence. This was a memory, preserved in dirt and silence. A breadcrumb, a cry for help left behind by small hands and unsteady breath. But why hadn't it been found? The search had spanned counties. Dogs, drones, volunteers, even thermal imaging. How had this place gone unnoticed? Unless... He stood slowly, surveying the area. The trees here were thick, branches low and tangled with brambles. It would have looked like dead space from the air, impenetrable, unremarkable. Unless you were a dog, unless you were this dog. Ranger sat now, ears forward, gaze fixed on Arthur, not waiting for praise, not asking for it. Just watching, as if to say, "Do you see it now?" Arthur crouched beside him, resting a hand gently between the dog's shoulder blades. "You didn't forget," he murmured. "All these years." His voice trailed off. In the distance, a jay called sharply and then fell silent. The forest held its breath. Arthur felt the old ache in his knees as he stood. He slipped the name tag into his coat pocket and looked deeper into the trees. The boy had been here, not briefly, long enough to drop a backpack, long enough to bury things, long enough for a dog to remember. He looked at Ranger again. "You trying to tell me he's still out there?" The wind answered for him, stirring the pine needles with a sucked, almost reverent sigh. Arthur knew this wasn't over. It wasn't even close. He looked down at the frost-covered earth, now disturbed, raw open, There were more things buried here, not just belongings. Truths, and maybe a second chance, too. The forest seemed to breathe, not with sound, but with weight, as if each tree, each knotted root, carried its own version of what had happened here and chose to stay silent. Arthur stood still a long moment, the name tag from Jonah's backpack heavy in his coat pocket, the toy figurine tucked beside it like some forgotten relic. Frost lingered on the brambles, but the rising sun filtered through in pale ribbons of light. And Ranger was already moving. The old dog didn't wait for permission. He padded forward, slow but purposeful, as if the act of walking this path meant more than Arthur could yet understand. "Ranger!" Arthur called softly, not out of command, but caution. The shepherd didn't break stride. His head was low, tail steady, nose close to the ground as he passed through the thicket and into the deeper woods. Arthur hesitated. He should have gone home, should have called someone, the sheriff, the news, maybe even the boy's mother if she was still around. But every logical thought sat just outside the reach of this moment, muffled by the sound of paws pressing into frost and breath carried like smoke through the trees. He adjusted his coat and followed. Step by step, they entered the unmarked parts of Hollow Valley, the wild borderland where nature had never been asked to yield. No one came out here anymore. There were no hunting markers, no fences, no trails, just the narrowing silence between tree trunks and memories that clung to the bark like old scars. And Ranger moved like he belonged, not wandering, not searching, retracing. Arthur caught up just enough to see the dog pause at a fork between two moss-laced ridges. Ranger sniffed the air, circled once, then veered left, slipping between two downed trees and pushing into the underbrush without hesitation. Arthur ducked beneath a fallen branch and kept close. His heart thudded, not from fear, but something deeper, something he hadn't felt since Elaine had passed, that quiet, maddening tug of meaning, drawing you forward whether you wanted to follow or not. The trail wound deeper now. Over time, the frost gave way to damp moss. The ground softened. Sunlight barely reached them anymore. But Ranger never faltered. His movements were deliberate, like he was chasing a scent no one else could sense, something more than smell, something old. Arthur found himself breathing quieter, like speaking aloud might break whatever this was. After nearly 30 minutes, the dog stopped. They stood before a sloped hill, steep and knotted with roots at its base. Ranger pawed lightly at a patch of turned soil, then backed away. Not digging, inviting, Arthur approached slowly. There was no obvious clue, no object, no blood, no fabric this time. But there was a feeling, that strange tightness behind the ribs, like something had happened here, something more than trauma, more than fear, something remembered. Arthur crouched beside Ranger, fingers running through the damp moss and dirt. No sign, no noise, just the breath of trees and the hush of a valley watching. "You've been here before," Arthur whispered. Ranger turned his head slowly, eyes locking with Arthur's, and in that look not human, not mystical, but alive, Arthur felt the truth crawl up from his gut to his throat. This dog wasn't guessing. He was remembering. A past he couldn't name, a boy he couldn't forget, a mission he'd never been told was over. Arthur sat back against a tree, heart pounding. How much had this dog seen? What had he carried all these years? And why now? Why, after so long, had Ranger found his way to him, a lonely man on a dying farm with no badge, no training, and no reason to be a part of this story? Unless Arthur looked out across the ridge ahead, where the trees thinned just slightly, like a breath held before a revelation. Unless this was no accident, unless some part of the valley had waited too. Ranger stood again, eyes trained on the path ahead. He didn't look back this time. Arthur rose slowly, knees stiff, fingers brushing dirt from his jeans. And then, without speaking, he followed. Because when a dog that doesn't beg, doesn't bark, doesn't break, decides a trail is worth remembering, you follow it. Even if it leads to things you're not ready to see. Even if it leads to truth. The forest opened like a secret, being whispered slowly, reluctantly. They stepped into a small clearing where the trees curved inward as if guarding something. The light here was strange, dappled, distant, the kind of light that felt like it didn't belong to the present. Arthur's boots sank slightly into softened earth as he entered. His breath caught, not from fatigue, but instinct. Something had happened here. Ranger stood still ahead of him, unmoving, ears forward, body tense, but calm. Then, slowly, the drug stepped toward a patch of overgrown brush at the far side of the clearing. The grass was taller there, wilder. Beneath it, a shallow rise in the soil, almost unnoticeable, unless you were looking for something that never stopped calling you back. Ranger began to dig, but not frantically this time. Carefully, like uncovering memory, not chasing it. Arthur dropped to one knee beside him, brushing away the topsoil, layer by layer. Roots crisscrossed like scars in the dirt. The old dog paused and stepped back, giving Arthur space. His fingers struck wood, rough, warped, cold. He scraped more dirt aside until the corners of a small crate emerged, a wooden box, aged by time and silence. No lock, no markings, just a single iron latch rusted to a dull brown. Arthur hesitated, then opened it. Inside, the first thing he saw was paper, lots of it, crumpled and yellowed, sealed in plastic sleeves that had fogged with age. On top, missing person flyers, dozens. Some from years ago, some recent, names, age, smiling school photos. Children, all of them. Arthur's chest tightened. He flipped further. Beneath the flyers were trail maps, highlighted in red ink, dotted with notes and hand-drawn arrows. Some marked zone cleared, others access denied. Then GPS coordinates on laminated index cards, some written in trembling pen, others typed and printed, weathered by moisture. And finally, at the very bottom of the crate, wrapped in waxed canvas like a secret, was a badge, circular, tarnished. It read MCS, Mason County Search and Recovery, Tactical Division. Arthur turned it over in his palm. He'd never heard of them. Not the official teams, not the ones that made the news. This wasn't law enforcement or fire department. This was something else, something private. A team with resources and reasons to be forgotten. He looked at Ranger, and for the first time since the dog had arrived on his porch, Arthur saw something new in the shepherd's eyes. Recognition, not of the box, but what it meant. Ranger lowered his head and let out a sound so low it was barely a whimper. Not pain, not fear, grief. Arthur sank to the dirt, hands trembling. The box wasn't just a record. It was a grave of effort of lives no one had saved. Trails that ended in trees and silence, parents who never found peace. And somewhere along the way, this dog had been there for all of it. He hadn't just found Jonah's scent. He'd never stopped searching, even after the team was disbanded, even after the valley forgot. He had remembered the way back, had carried it inside him, year after year, until someone finally listened. Arthur didn't know what broke first, his disbelief or his sense of detachment, but something in him cracked wide open. He looked back at the badge, the maps, the names. "Jesus," he whispered, voice rough, "you weren't some stray." Ranger sat down next to the box, his breathing steady. Arthur placed a hand gently on the shepherd's head, fingers brushing through the coarse fur between his ears. "You were a working dog, weren't you?" The dog didn't react. He didn't have to. The truth sat between them now, quiet, weathered, unburied. Arthur reached for one of the flyers and held it to the light. A girl, 8 years old, missing since 2000. Smiling wide with teeth too big for her face. How many more? How many had this dog searched for? And how many had he remembered? Arthur sat back, the forest spinning a little around him. This wasn't just about Jonah anymore. This was something larger. A trail of silence, pieced together by paw prints and buried memory. And the one who never gave up was sitting right beside him, waiting, not for praise, but for purpose. Arthur looked around the clearing, suddenly aware that the trees weren't just watching, they were holding something. The valley had kept its secrets. But the dog? He had kept the truth. The driveway was nothing but loose gravel and stubborn weeds curling up through years of neglect. Arthur pulled his truck into the shade of a dying elm and sat there for a moment, listening to the tick of the cooling engine. The sun was just beginning its descent, casting the world in the kind of orange light that made everything feel older, like time had slowed to watch. Ahead of him stood a squat, one-story ranch home with flaking paint and boarded windows on the east side. The screen door hung slightly crooked, and a rusted wind chime ticked a soft, broken tune against the siding. Arthur stepped out, the GPS card and badge still in his coat pocket, heavy as a stone he didn't know how to throw. Ranger jumped down after him, silent as always. They made their way to the porch together. Hank Donovan hadn't answered the phone, but Arthur knew he still lived out here, had for years. Everyone in Hollow Valley remembered the old deputy, quiet, sharp, knew when to speak, and more importantly, when not to. Arthur knocked once, no response. He knocked again. Then the screen creaked open from inside, and there he was, Hank Donovan, still broad in the shoulders, though age had hollowed his eyes and turned his hands into shaking tools. He looked at Arthur, then at the dog. Then his whole face changed. He stepped onto the porch like he was walking into a memory he thought was dead. "No," he muttered, eyes locked on Ranger. "I'll be damned." Arthur opened his mouth to explain, but Hank raised a hand to stop him. "That's him?" Hank said, voice barely above a whisper. "Ain't it?" Arthur nodded slowly. "I think so." Hank took a breath like he'd been holding it for years. 7 years, he muttered. "They told us he ran off. Claimed he broke rank, refused to leave a dead trail. That's what they said." He dropped onto a rusted metal chair, exhaling hard. Arthur stayed standing. "What happened out there, Hank?" The old man looked up, his eyes once cold steel, now shimmered with something between guilt and grief. "We were close," he said. "Closer than they wanted us to be." Arthur frowned. "To what?" "Jonah, the boy. We had search dogs, drones, even brought in private CRMCS. That's where he came from." He gestured toward Ranger. "They don't exist anymore, officially. Got absorbed, shut down, renamed Pick Your Poison. But back then, they were good, and that dog, he was one of the best." Arthur swallowed hard. "So why was the search ended?" Hank looked down at his hands. "There was pressure," he said quietly. "Higher-ups, county commissioner's office. They said funding ran dry. Claimed terrain was unstable, but that wasn't it. We found prints, signs someone was still moving out there. We were close. Too close." "To what?" Arthur asked again. Hank's voice dropped. "To something they didn't want found." Silence settled like dust. "I saw the flyers," Arthur said. "The maps. There's a box buried out there with names, kids." Hank's jaw clenched. "I know." "You knew?" Arthur's voice hardened. "And you did nothing?" "I was a deputy, Arthur, not God." His hands shook slightly. "They threatened to pull pensions, blackmail families. One of our SAR team members lost her license for speaking up. Ellie Voss. Look her up if she's still around." Arthur felt the burn behind his ribs, fury and clarity locking arms. "This dog never gave up," Arthur said, his voice low. 7 years later, he came back and found the damn trail again." Hank looked at Ranger. "Because no one told him to stop," he said. "We did. They told us to forget. But a dog like him, he remembers." Arthur stepped forward, lowering his voice. "Then help me. Help him. Because I think Jonah might still be out there." Hank went still. "You found something?" "More than something," Arthur said. "Ranger led me straight to a piece of Jonah's shirt. Name tag, backpack, and now fresh ground. A clearing that wasn't cleared." Hank stared at him, face pale. Then he leaned forward, eyes hard again. "Listen to me," he said. "If this trail leads where I think it does, some truths were buried for a reason." Arthur didn't blink. "And some truths are still breathing." Hank looked at Ranger one last time, then he stood. "I'll get my coat." The woods had changed, not in appearance, but in atmosphere. As Arthur followed Ranger through the thickening brush, something hung in the air now like a held breath before a confession. The trees whispered above them, their bare limbs clattering softly as the wind slithered between them like a rumor. Hank had insisted on staying behind for now, said he needed to check something, though Arthur suspected it had more to do with fear than logistics. Some men carried guilt like a badge. Hank wore his like a wound. But Ranger didn't hesitate. He moved with a confidence that felt older than the forest itself. Every step, every pause, every change in direction, it was precise, purposeful. Not like a hound chasing scent, but a soldier returning to a battlefield he knew too well. Arthur kept up, boots crunching over wet leaves, nerves drawn taut. The air was colder here, deeper, as if this part of Hollow Valley had been preserved in the silence of a single long-held secret. Then, suddenly, Ranger stopped. They'd come to a natural drop-off, maybe 10 feet down, where a narrow ravine sliced through the earth like a forgotten scar. Moisture had pooled at the bottom, collecting into soft, sludgy mud. Ranger stood at the edge, unmoving, tail raised slightly. His nose quivered. Arthur stepped beside him and saw them. Footprints, small, human, fresh. Arthur's heart stopped mid-beat. The imprints weren't warped by time or weather. They were sharp, sunken with weight, toe shapes visible in the muck. A child's foot, no shoe tread, just skin, just pressure. And 2 steps ahead, another print, deeper, like the child had paused or looked back. Arthur crouched, hands on his knees. Dear God! He scanned the ravine floor, 6 prints in total, leading toward a bank of moss and bramble on the far side, faint but real, moving away from them. His voice cracked. These are new. Ranger let out a soft, low whine. Arthur pressed a hand to the mud, felt the cold dampness, the living presence of it. This wasn't a memory. This was now. He stood slowly, blood rushing in his ears. It couldn't be. 7 years? No one survives alone in these woods that long. Not a boy, not like that. But something deep inside him, older than logic, refused to dismiss it. Jonah, he whispered. A gust of wind pushed through the trees, lifting a crow from a nearby branch. The bird shrieked and vanished into the sky. Arthur looked again. The prints were small but spaced apart, not stumbling, not erratic. Whoever made them was moving fast and straight, like they knew the land, like they'd survived it. He turned to Ranger. You knew. The dog didn't move. His gaze stayed fixed on the prints, body tense, jaw set. He looked less like a pet and more like a memory made flesh called back to finish what had been taken from him. Arthur wiped his palms on his coat, breath short. They weren't chasing a ghost anymore. They were following a living boy. A boy who remembered the dog. A boy who still might be waiting for someone to come find him. Arthur felt a rush of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. Hope. Not the soft kind, the aching kind, the kind that clings to the edge of grief and dares to believe anyway. He looked out past the ravine toward the tree line where the footprints vanished. I don't know where he's going, he murmured, but we're not stopping now. Ranger whined again, this time higher, sharper. Arthur turned. The dog had started moving, circling down toward the ravine's edge. His paws sunk into the mud with practiced care. He paused only once at the first footprint, lowered his head, and sniffed. Then he kept going. Arthur followed, not because he knew the way, but because Ranger did. And for the first time since Elaine died, since the farm had started falling apart, since silence had become more comfortable than speaking, Arthur felt something in his chest crack open. A boy was out there, still breathing, still moving, and the one who had never stopped searching was now leading the way. The woods quieted in a way that wasn't peaceful. It was too still. No birdsong, no wind, just the faint crunch of Arthur's boots and Ranger's measured steps as they moved deeper along the trail carved by small, bare feet. The sun had begun to slant low, bleeding gold through the branches, painting the forest in tones of memory and caution. Arthur could feel the temperature dropping, not just from the air, but from something older, instinctual. They reached a thinning in the trees where the ground curved into a natural bowl, shielded by heavy brush and a steep ridge wall. Ranger halted first, his ears lifting, body angled low. A soft growl simmered in his throat, not hostile, not alarmed. Alert. Arthur ducked beneath a low branch and stopped breathing. There it was. A blue tarp strung between 2 trees with bits of wire and a shredded backpack strap. Beneath it, The ground had been cleared and padded with pine needles. Trash wrappers lay scattered, granola bars, jerky, a cracked plastic bottle. To the left, someone had propped up a circle of stones blackened by ash. A fire pit, cold now, but used recently. Then Arthur saw something beside the pit, a piece of wood about the size of a grown man's hand, carved rough with a bit or rock, shaped unmistakably like a dog. Arthur crouched, picked it up gently. It had no detail, just the form of a four-legged figure, head slightly raised, tail curled like it was mid-run, primitive but recognizable. He didn't speak, couldn't. Ranger stepped closer and froze beside him, shoulders tense. His nose twitched. Then he turned to the trees behind them. Arthur looked up, following the dog's gaze. Nothing, but the air shifted. That sixth sense quiet, but certain pressed against the back of Arthur's neck. They weren't alone. Something or someone was watching. He rose slowly, eyes scanning the tree line. The shadows moved with the wind, but one shape seemed still. Too still. Then gone. "Jonah?" Arthur said softly, not expecting a response. Silence. Ranger didn't bark. He didn't chase. He simply stood guard, positioning himself between Arthur and the trees, tail stiff, breath steady. His body language said everything. Not a threat, but not safe either. Arthur exhaled slowly. His voice was careful, low. "If you're out there, we're not here to hurt you." Still nothing. But the sense of presence lingered, like a heartbeat hiding in the roots of the forest itself. Arthur knelt, placing the carved dog gently on the stone ring, then stepped back. He looked toward the ridge wall barely visible behind the tarp, a natural barrier against wind and sight. That's when he noticed it. More carvings, faintly etched into the rock face. Stick figures, circles, trees. One figure held a dog, another showed a cave, drawn like an opening with a curling path behind it. Symbols, not sentences, but they spoke volumes. This wasn't just a shelter. It was a story, a map. Arthur turned to Ranger. "He's been surviving," he whispered, "for years." Ranger didn't move. His gaze still tracked the woods behind them. Arthur's mind reeled. A child, alone, building fire pits and carving dogs from memory, avoiding people, watching, hiding, but also remembering, and still choosing to stay near the place where he vanished, as if waiting for something or someone. Arthur stood quietly, not daring to disturb whatever fragile thread held this place together. He knew this moment wasn't for action. It was for listening. Let the trees breathe. Let the wind speak. Let the dog guard what remained of innocence, buried beneath years of dirt, silence, and fear. Arthur didn't call out again. He just stood still beside Ranger, letting the shadows watch, letting the boy, if he was there, choose whether hope could be trusted. The radio was wedged beneath a cluster of damp leaves, half buried near the fire pit. Arthur wouldn't have noticed it at all if Ranger hadn't paused mid-step, circled, and nudged his muzzle into the soil like he was retrieving something fragile. Arthur wiped it clean with his sleeve. Old, portable, the kind of emergency hand crank unit used in SAR kits from over a decade ago. The plastic casing was cracked near the base, and its antenna stuck out at an odd angle, but the dials moved, and the speaker wasn't broken. He sat down slowly, back against a moss-covered boulder, and turned the knob. Static. A low hum, an occasional crackle, a ghost's breath caught between frequencies. Arthur adjusted it carefully. The sound sharpened, hissed, then broke. "Hello?" His breath caught in his throat. He tapped the side of the radio, unsure if the sound was real or imagined. Then again. "Oh, Can you hear me?" A whisper barely there, brittle as frost. Arthur leaned in, heart pounding. His voice cracked as he spoke. "This is Arthur Langley. I'm not here to hurt you." Silence. Ranger stayed still, eyes scanning the trees. Arthur swallowed. "I think you've been alone for a long time." More static. A long pause. The forest seemed to lean in. Then, "The dog." Arthur's grip tightened. "I'm with him. His name's Ranger. He led me here." Another long pause, then barely audible. He remembered. Arthur's eyes burned. "I believe you're Jonah Reese." A rustle from the trees above. Not a squirrel, not a bird a shift. Human. Still no response. Arthur turned the dial again, slightly. "You don't have to come out. I just wanted you to know people still care. Your mother, she still lights a candle every year on your birthday. Hollow Valley never forgot you." The wind moved through the trees like a sigh. Arthur lowered his voice. "We're not the ones who stopped looking. They were." Another pause, this time longer, then another whisper. "They said I'd disappear if I spoke." Arthur closed his eyes. "We won't let that happen. You have my word." Silence. Then static gave way to breath, soft, measured. "He found me." Arthur looked at Ranger, who hadn't taken his eyes off the ridgeline. "Yes," Arthur said. "He never stopped." Then the transmission clicked. Gone. Dead air. Arthur held the unit to his chest like it was a heartbeat he could protect. There were no coordinates, no names, just a voice, alive, hesitant, watching, still listening. Arthur exhaled into the silence, and for the first time since he'd bought a tired, silent dog behind a barn, he smiled. The forest had gone blue with dusk. By the time Hank caught up, his breath was shallow, and his boots carried the weight of 7 years' worth of wrong turns. He didn't ask questions, just fell into step beside Arthur, his eyes occasionally flicking toward Ranger, who padded ahead like he'd never doubted where to go. The ridge emerged through the trees, quiet and jagged, its moss-covered face curled upward like the back of some great sleeping beast. The higher they climbed, the more the silence changed. Not empty, tense, held. Ranger stopped near a thicket of brambles and dropped to a crouch. He didn't bark, just stood still, nose lowered, eyes fixed. Arthur pushed past the last branches and saw it. A cleft in the stone, barely a meter wide, cloaked in moss and vines, invisible unless you knew where to look, unless you remembered, a camouflaged cave. Hank exhaled. He was hiding in plain sight. Arthur looked to Ranger. The dog didn't move, but the message was clear. This is it. They stepped inside, one by one. The light shifted, cooler, quieter. The cave wasn't deep, but it was lived in, very lived in. To the left, a stack of empty cans, sorted by type, jerky, beans, soup, some so old the labels had peeled. To the right, a bed of pine needles and old jackets, neatly arranged. A blanket threadbare and patched with duct tape lay folded at the head. Beside it, a plastic flashlight missing its lens. Further in, a fire pit burned black with charcoal, stones arranged around it like chairs. And on the far wall etched into stone with deliberate, childlike strokes drawings, Arthur moved toward them slowly, like stepping into someone's dreams or nightmares. Stick figures, one small, one large, sometimes with a dog beside them. Some showed trees, others houses. One had a sun with a line across it, another a figure lying down, red scratches carved around it, a timeline in pictures, a boy's life told in silence. Hank removed his cap, holding it in both hands. "He survived here," he murmured. "Winter, summer, rain." Arthur knelt near the blanket and picked up a small item wrapped in cloth. Unfolded gently, it revealed a cracked compass and a child's school ID tag. Jonah Reese, Grade 2, Hollow Valley Elementary. Arthur didn't speak. The cave wasn't just shelter. It was a fortress, a memory, a monument to a child who had been erased but never truly gone. "He made it," Arthur whispered. 7 years. "No kid survives that alone," Hank said quietly. "Not out here." Arthur turned to him, so maybe he wasn't. They looked at Ranger. The dog stood like a statue at the mouth of the cave, ears forward, breath slow, as if remembering his own footprints across this stone. Arthur realized something then. This wasn't Ranger's first time here. He'd been to this cave before, with Jonah, maybe once, maybe dozens of times. Maybe back when the world had turned away and only a dog had chosen to stay. Arthur sat down slowly on the cave floor, and for a moment nothing moved, only breath, only memory, only the sound of quiet loyalty echoing off stone. The silence inside the cave thickened. No longer empty, but waiting. Arthur and Hank stood motionless as Ranger took a single step forward. His ears twitched, his eyes locked on something deeper in the shadows, beyond the reach of light just past the fire pit's rim. Then a rustle, barely audible, the scrape of bare feet on stone. Breath held, not just by the men, but by the forest itself. From the darkness beyond the carved wall, a boy emerged. Thin, small for his age, but older than his face should have looked. His skin was pale under a coat of dirt. His clothes, tattered layers of once colorful fabric, hung from his frame like ghosts that hadn't let go. He didn't run. He didn't flinch. He just stood there, barefoot, bare-souled, watching. His eyes, deep hazel, rimmed with shadows, went straight past Arthur and Hank and locked on Ranger. The boy's lips parted, dry and unsure. Then came a word, croaked, fragile, but alive. "Ranger!" The sound shattered something inside Arthur. Ranger whined, a single, high-pitched note like a song long forgotten, returning home. His body tensed for just a second. Then he stepped forward, tail low, head bowed slightly. The boy didn't move until Ranger was 3 steps away. Then he dropped to his knees. His fingers, shaking, reached out, but didn't grab, didn't cling. They hovered, hesitant. Ranger closed the distance and nudged him, gently, right beneath the chin, like he'd done it 100 times before. And the boy crumbled forward, not in fear, not in pain, but in recognition. He hugged Ranger, both arms wrapped around the dog's neck like it was the last solid thing in the world. No sobs, no screams, just the raw collapse of a soul into the only truth it could still believe in. Arthur's chest tightened. He looked away. Even Hank stepped back, blinking hard as if giving the moment space to breathe. The boy Jonah buried his face in Ranger's fur. His shoulders shook with silent tremors. His fingers dug into the dog's thick neck, like he was afraid this was a dream, that it might vanish if he opened his eyes. But Ranger didn't move. He stood firm, tail low, nose tucked into Jonah's shoulder, breathing steady as if saying, "You're safe now. I'm here. I never left." Arthur swallowed the knot in his throat. His voice, when it came, was barely a whisper. "You remembered him," he said to Ranger. "You never stopped." Jonah finally looked up, his face streaked with grime, eyes rimmed with red. But inside them something flickered. Recognition, not just of the dog, but of hope. He didn't ask who Arthur was. He didn't ask what day it was or how long it had been. He just whispered again. "He came back." Arthur nodded slowly. "No, Jonah," he said gently. "You did." And as the last light of day faded behind the ridge, inside a cave of stone and carved memories, the silence finally gave way to breathe, to warmth, to the quiet sound of a boy and a dog finding each other again. The safe house wasn't much, just an old ranger cabin on the north edge of Hollow Valley, tucked behind a wall of cedar trees and surrounded by fog-thick silence. The windows were boarded from the inside. A propane heater ticked in the corner. Dust motes hovered in the morning light like ash left behind by memory. Jonah sat cross-legged on the cot, wrapped in an oversized flannel shirt. His frame still trembled from the cold, though the room had warmed. Ranger never left his side. Arthur stood by the stove, nursing black coffee. Hank leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching Jonah with a look that was both protective and haunted. They had called no one, not yet. Too much still didn't make sense. Jonah stared at the floor for a long time before speaking. His voice, when it came, was soft like something pulled up from underwater. "There was a man," he said. Arthur turned. Jonah didn't look up. "Not the one from the news, not the one everyone thinks took me." Hank stepped forward. "You remember his name?" "No." Jonah shook his head. "He never said it, just called me kid, like I was someone else's problem." Arthur lowered himself into the chair beside him. "What did he look like?" Jonah's eyes shifted. "He wore green, like forest ranger green, not a uniform I'd seen before, and he had a badge." "A ranger?" Hank asked. Jonah hesitated. "Not exactly. The badge was different. Homemade, maybe. But the letters," he swallowed. "It said MCS." Arthur froze. Hank stiffened. "Are you sure?" Jonah nodded slowly. "And he had a tattoo on his arm, same letters, just the three CS." Arthur exchanged a glance with Hank. "Mason County search," he whispered. "That's impossible," Hank said. "That team was disbanded 5 years ago, after the funding scandal." "They never filed the termination notice," Arthur replied. "Just dissolved on paper." Hank looked at Jonah. "Did this man hurt you?" "No," Jonah said quietly. "He hid me." Arthur blinked. "He what?" Jonah's voice dropped. "He found me after the first night I got lost. I was trying to follow Ranger. I slipped down the ridge, hit my head. When I woke up, I was in a tent. He said if I made noise, they'd come back." He said to stay hidden. Said people were asking the wrong questions, that if I spoke, I'd disappear for real this time. Ranger gave a low, barely audible whine. Jonah looked down. I didn't know who to trust, but Ranger always came back. Not every day, but when it got really cold, when I needed him, he found me. Arthur sat back, absorbing every word. A rogue rescuer, a badge that shouldn't exist, a tattoo matching a disbanded unit, and a warning that wasn't meant for a child, but for anyone trying to uncover the truth. Jonah finally looked up. He didn't want to hurt me, but he was scared of someone else. He always looked over his shoulder. Hank stepped away from the door, muttering to himself. They buried it. Buried the whole damn thing. Arthur's voice was steady. We'll unbury it. He looked at Jonah, who for the first time didn't look lost, only wary. But not alone, not anymore. The wind moved restlessly through the trees that lined the old train depot, an abandoned outpost near the edge of Hollow Valley, swallowed by rust, time, and neglect. Arthur parked the truck under a broken floodlight. Hank checked his watch, muttering something about how some ghosts prefer to be late. Jonah remained back at the cabin asleep, Ranger curled protectively at his side. They waited in silence until a sedan crept up the gravel road, headlights dimmed. Out stepped Ellie Voss, hair tucked under a knit cap. Thin frame wrapped in a utility jacket 2 sizes too big. She looked over her shoulder twice before walking toward them, a canvas satchel slung across her chest like a shield. Hank stepped forward. Ellie. Did anyone follow you? She asked without preamble. No. Good. Her voice was lower now, tighter. Arthur nodded to the satchel. That what I think it is. She glanced around once more before unzipping it. Her fingers moved quickly, like muscle memory sharpened by fear. Then she handed over a thin manila folder creased, water-stained, but unmistakably real. Hank opened it, flipping through. Aerial maps, time-stamped transcripts, shift schedules from the SAR dispatch, and then redacted statements. Names blacked out, routes erased. And beneath it all, a hand-scribbled note. Jonah last seen 3.2 miles east of Sector E6. Witness account suppressed. Media alert never approved. Arthur's chest tightened. This was never in the official file, Hank muttered. Ellie's eyes darkened. Because they never meant to find him. She turned to Arthur. I was reassigned 3 days after raising the issue. My replacement never called a follow-up search. I watched them box up the evidence in the back of a county cruiser and drive it straight to Mercer's storage shed. Dan Mercer? Hank asked, already knowing. Ellie nodded. He ran point on the MCS unit, said the terrain was too unstable, claimed the dogs had picked up conflicting scents. But that was a lie. I saw Ranger's initial trajectory. He was leading us straight to the ridge. Arthur clenched his jaw, and they pulled him off. They pulled all the dogs off, Ellie said. Every single canine unit was reassigned within 48 hours, even Ranger. She looked at the 2 men in front of her, both seasoned, both tired, and both standing in the growing realization that they'd been played. Why didn't you come forward earlier? Arthur asked, gentler than Hank would have. Ellie hesitated. I did, quietly. I submitted a report to internal review. It never made it out of the building. A week later, my father's medical benefits. He's a veteran. We're suddenly under investigation, and someone slashed my tires in the hospital lot. Hank swore under his breath. Arthur just said, they wanted to erase Jonah. And they almost did, Ellie whispered. She looked up, her eyes catching the glint of the truck's chrome. Whatever you're planning, she added, make it loud. Arthur tucked the folder under his coat. Oh, we will, he said. The morning broke in gold across Hollow Valley, but it brought no warmth. Arthur was chopping wood at the side of the house, letting the rhythm of the axe distract from the growing storm behind his ribs. Jonah had barely spoken since Ellie's revelations. He spent most of the night curled against Ranger, eyes wide open in the dark, listening for sounds only he seemed to fear. Arthur didn't blame him, but it was Max Quiet, watchful Max, who noticed it first. The dog's head snapped up, ears pricking toward the gravel road that wound along the ridge. He let out a low, unbroken growl. Arthur followed his gaze. There, just beyond the edge of the trees, idling beneath the cover of morning mist, sat a black SUV, unmoving, windows tinted darker than legal, license plate coated in a fine smear of mud, just enough to obscure. Arthur set down the axe. Inside the house, Jonah stood frozen at the window. His voice came out in a whisper, not afraid but remembering. That's him. Arthur turned slowly. You're sure? Jonah nodded. The man who kept me hidden. The boy didn't blink. His fingers gripped the windowsill with white knuckles. He wore the green jacket. Same kind of car. I know it's him. Ranger stood beside Jonah, stiff as stone. Max had moved to the front door, planting himself like a sentry. The air in the room changed, charged, heavy. No barking, just readiness. Arthur grabbed his jacket and stepped onto the porch, every sense sharpening with each step. He didn't take a weapon. He didn't need to. The SUV's engine purred softly, but the driver didn't emerge, didn't speak, didn't move. He just watched. Arthur walked halfway down the path, boots crunching frost. I know who you are, he called, and I know what you did. Silence. The engine gave a subtle hiccup, then returned to idle. Inside the house, Jonah pulled back from the window. His breathing had gone shallow. Ranger nudged him gently, trying to ground him. The boy placed a trembling hand on the dog's head and whispered something only Ranger heard. The SUV door never opened, but Arthur saw it just for a second. Through the tint, a flash of eyes, recognition, regret, and something darker. He turned away, not out of fear, but calculation. Go ahead, he muttered under his breath. Watch, that's all you'll be doing. By the time he stepped back onto the porch, the SUV was pulling away, tires leaving twin scars in the frost-covered grass. Arthur met Jonah's gaze through the window. It's not over, the boy said. Arthur nodded once. No, but it's starting to be. Behind him, Max stood still, eyes narrowed toward the road, and somewhere deep in his chest, Ranger released a soft, guttural growl, not of fear, but of memory. The past had come home, and it wasn't leaving quietly. The granary hadn't stored grain in over 15 years. Its roof sagged like an old man's spine. The windows were boarded with mismatched planks, and rust had spread across the silo like a terminal illness. But inside, beneath the floorboards, past the cobwebs and rot, was everything they weren't supposed to find. Arthur lifted the trapdoor with a crowbar, revealing the stairs to the subcellar that only 2 people in town remembered. He was one of them. The other had died last winter. Ellie descended first, flashlight sweeping through the stale dark. Hank followed, a coil of tension running down his back. The old generator hadn't worked in years, but the wooden filing cabinets were still there, buried under tarps in forgotten silence. "This is where Mercer kept backup files," Arthur said, "for the original MCS deployments." Hank cracked a smile that didn't reach his eyes. The ones they swore were lost in the flood. Ellie flipped open her notebook, filled with chicken scratch maps and hand-drawn grids. She compared the layouts with labels on the dusty drawers. Sector E4, Incident 2K9 deployment logs, Ranger Detail 071B. Arthur opened the first drawer and pulled out a bundle of manila envelopes sealed with brittle masking tape. Ellie tore one open. Inside were printed Jeep logs, marked in red pen with timestamps lining up to the week Jonah had disappeared. "Look at this," she whispered, pointing. "These alerts came in 3 nights in a row. Thermal anomalies east of Hollow Ridge. Same quadrant Ranger kept trying to search." "And they flagged it?" Hank asked, squinting. Ellie nodded. "Twice. Marked it deprioritized. Then on the 3rd night, it was scrubbed entirely." "Look at the handwriting. Does that look like a standard note to you?" Arthur took the paper. The comment scribbled in ink read, "Unit advised to shift focus west. Do not escalate. Directive from DM." "DM," Hank said slowly. "Dan Mercer." "Mercer knew Jonah was east of the ridge," Ellie said, "and he ordered the search away from it." Arthur set the page down carefully. "He didn't lose Jonah. He covered it up." Ellie handed over another map, layers of transparent overlays taped to a folded topo. "This one shows all MCS canine movements for that week. Every trail but one stopped within 200 feet of that ridge." Arthur looked up. "And which dog kept pushing beyond it?" She turned the map over. Scrawled on the bottom, K907B. Handler, undisclosed, dog name, Ranger. They stood in silence, surrounded by forgotten records that weren't supposed to exist, staring at the paper trail that had led a town to mourn and a boy to vanish. "Everything we need is right here," Hank said, voice low. "They buried it under bureaucracy and dust, but they missed one thing." Arthur met his eyes. The dog remembered. Ellie's hands trembled slightly as she placed the papers into a new folder. Ranger had been dismissed. The evidence had been buried. But the truth, they were holding it in their hands now. The name surfaced like a bruise under fading light. Dan Mercer, Hank said it aloud, inside the kitchen of the cabin that had become both a hideout and a war room. The file folder lay open on the table, papers fanned out like crime scene photographs, maps, shift logs, directives, all marked with the same cryptic initials. DM Ranger lay beneath the table, but his ears twitched every time the name was spoken, like it belonged to something deeper than memory, something close to pain. Jonah sat hunched near the stove, his knees drawn up, his voice brittle. He talked slow, like he was being careful. Hank turned toward him. "You remember his face?" Jonah shook his head. "Only his voice. He didn't let me look at him much. He wore gloves, a hood, but his boots were loud, steel-toed. He smelled like gasoline, and the way he said my name like it hurt to say out loud." Arthur crouched beside him. "Was he the one who fed you?" "Sometimes," Jonah whispered. "Other times it was someone else. But he was the one who brought Ranger." The room went still. "You saw Ranger while you were in hiding?" Hank asked. Jonah nodded. "Once, he wasn't allowed to come close. They pulled him back with a chain." Arthur's jaw tightened. Jonah closed his eyes, voice thinner now. But he looked at me, just once, and he growled, not at me, at the man behind me. Ellie entered, holding a printout she'd made from the records salvaged from the granary. Mercer didn't just work SAR. He was also part of the MCS unit, classified under Operations Liaison, but his real title was Containment Response Officer. Arthur stood slowly. Containment, he repeated, like the boy was a threat. Ellie nodded. Or like the truth was. She laid down another paper, Mercer's last known assignment, dated 2 days after Jonah's disappearance. Then nothing. His resignation was marked voluntary, but there was no forwarding address, no final debrief, just a stamped line in red ink. Clearance terminated. Hank leaned against the wall, frowning. He vanished, just like Jonah was supposed to. Ellie glanced toward the window. Except Mercer's vanishing came with a pension and silence. Jonah shifted, his voice barely above a whisper. He told me not to speak, that if I did, the dog would be taken from me forever. Arthur reached across the table and gently laid a hand over Jonah's. That's not going to happen now, he said. We have your voice. We have Ranger, and we've got the name. Jonah nodded slowly, eyes wet but defiant. Outside, dusk pressed in around the cabin, but inside, something old and cold was cracking. A man had been named. A memory was no longer silent, and the truth had begun to breathe. It was just past dusk when the black SUV returned. The horizon was still smudged with the last red of day, the kind of light that painted the world in half-truths, neither night nor fully forgiven by sun. Arthur was on the porch, sharpening a broken rake, when he heard the slow crunch of gravel. The sound wasn't rushed, wasn't unsure, just steady, like someone coming back to finish a conversation that had never truly ended. He didn't move at first. He only stood, the wooden handle of the rake gripped loosely in his hand as the SUV pulled up to the edge of the field and came to a stop. No engine kill, no door opening, no sound, but the idle hum of something unspoken. Inside the house, Jonah stepped quietly to the window. His breath fogged the glass. That's him, he whispered. That's Mercer. Arthur stepped off the porch and walked across the frost-hardened earth, each step deliberate, measured. He stopped 10 feet from the vehicle. Behind him, Ranger padded forward silently, not waiting for a command, just positioning himself slightly in front, as if to say, if you're going to speak to him, you'll speak through me. The window on the driver's side lowered 2 inches, enough for breath to escape. Not a word, not a wave, just Mercer's eyes, pale, sunken, watching Arthur the way a man watches a storm that used to belong to him. You've got nerve, Arthur said. Driving up here like you left your wallet. No response. You know we have your files, your directives. We know who buried the truth. The window didn't roll down any further. Mercer's hand never reached for the gear shift, but Arthur saw it. A flicker, guilt, fear, and something even colder, acceptance. You left that boy in the woods like he was debris from a mission gone wrong, Arthur said. And you chained the only soul who tried to find him. Still silence, then a shift. Ranger's ears flattened, his body tensed. Mercer leaned forward just enough to be seen. Arthur didn't step back. I'm not here to hurt you, Arthur said, softer now. But I swear to God, if you come near this farm again, if that boy even senses you nearby." He didn't finish. He didn't have to. Ranger took a step forward, low, controlled, a warning, not a threat, and Mercer finally moved. His hand went to the wheel. The SUV pulled away. No screech, no drama, but Arthur knew what that look meant. Mercer had come not to threaten, but to reckon. As the tail lights disappeared over the ridge, Arthur turned back toward the house. Ranger didn't move for a long time. He just stared after the car, like he was cataloging something far older than hatred, something that had once been trust. Back inside, Jonah asked only one question: "Will he come back?" Arthur met his eyes. He never left. It was the barn where it all unraveled. Not the house, not the field, not the granary where paper trails whispered in dust. But here between rusted pitchforks and hay bales, cracked by age, Mercer finally broke. Arthur had waited for him, not with threats, not with guns, but with truth. And truth had a weight all its own. You didn't need to swing it. Just place it down in front of a guilty man and watch it crush him. Mercer stepped into the barn after midnight, as promised, shadow clinging to his shoulders like consequence. He looked smaller than before, like the silence had shrunk him. Ranger stood beside the wooden ladder to the loft. Silent, watching, not growling this time, just waiting. Hank Adeli flanked the back, out of sight. This was Arthur's moment to begin. "You came!" "I didn't think I would," Mercer said hoarsely. "Didn't think I had it in me." "You do," Arthur replied. "You always did. That was the problem." For a long moment, the only sound was the creak of the wind slipping through warped wood. Then Mercer sat on an overturned crate, like his legs could no longer carry the truth he'd held for 7 years. "I didn't take him," he said. "I swear to you, I didn't take Jonah." Arthur didn't interrupt, just nodded once. "I was on Ridge 4 when the heat signature came in. Everyone else was told to sweep the western line, but Ranger, he pulled east." Mercer's voice cracked like a dry branch. "I followed, found the ball, alone, crying, shaking, but alive." He ran a hand through his gray-streaked hair. "Then I saw it behind him, in the valley. Flashlights, 2 men, civilian truck, and crates being moved across the creek bed. Smuggling run, not just contraband. It was equipment, military grade, stamped with DOD codes." Arthur's eyes narrowed. "And you recognized them?" "One of them took off his glove," Mercer said, "showed a ring, county chairman seal, and then I heard the name." He looked up. "Blake Winston." The air dropped 10 degrees. "That boy wasn't just lost," Mercer continued. "He stumbled onto something they were willing to bury people for. And if we brought him back, if he talked, they'd kill him," Arthur finished. Mercer nodded slowly, the shame tightening every line in his face. "So, I made the choice. I told Ranger to stay. I told the team the thermal hit was a false reading. Then I took Jonah, and I hit him." "Where?" Hank's voice came from the shadows now. Mercer turned toward it. "Cave in the ridge. I checked on him when I could, dropped supplies, told him the world wasn't safe. Lied to a child so he wouldn't step into a bullet." Ellie stepped forward. "You buried a search operation. You let his mother grieve a ghost." Mercer didn't argue. "I told myself I was saving him," he said, "but maybe I was just protecting myself from Winston, from shame, from a truth too big for a report. Ranger moved now just enough to rest a paw against Arthur's boot. Quiet approval, or warning. "Why come back?" Arthur asked. Mercer looked toward the barn door. "Because it's not over. Winston's still out there, still cleaning house, and if I don't speak now, Jonah's story ends with a bullet instead of a beginning." Arthur stepped forward, pulled a small audio recorder from his jacket pocket, and placed it on the crate beside Mercer. "Then talk." And this time, Mercer did. The red light blinked on, small, steady, and unblinking like the eye of conscience. Mercer sat rigid on the crate, jaw clenched, sweat blooming at his collar despite the cold. The old tape recorder whirred softly as Hank pressed record, his thumb pausing over the worn button like it might set off a bomb. "Start from the beginning," Hank said. And Mercer did. His voice was uneven at first. Years of silence don't break clean. But the moment the first name fell from his lips, something shifted, like an old dam cracking. Blake Winston, county supervisor then, county chairman now, code name in MSIS files, Briar. The barn went quiet. Even the wind hushed. He orchestrated off-the-books logistics transfers through the East Ravine. Crates were marked as disaster relief. They weren't. They were electronics, weapons, some marked surplus, but never logged. He exhaled, eyes down. "I was told to clear the path. My SAR team was the perfect cover search, and rescue units don't get second-guessed. But when Jonah stumbled into the ridgeline that night, everything changed." Ranger lay near Jonah at the barn entrance. The boy didn't flinch anymore when he heard Mercer's voice, but he didn't get closer either. Trust was a bridge that only burned once. "I was told to report Jonah as deceased. Cause of death, exposure. We had the fake scene ready, broken jacket, a staged boot print in a sinkhole. But Ranger wouldn't stop. He kept leading us east again and again, like he knew the boy wasn't dead, like he refused to lie." Mercer's voice cracked, but he went on. "I didn't plan to take the boy. I panicked. I sedated him. I brought him to the cave, and I buried the rest with my clearance." Hank didn't speak. Neither did Arthur. The silence was the weight between truth and justice. "For years, I checked in, dropped food, left batteries for a radio, told myself I was protecting him. But the moment I saw that dog again, when he walked back into that auction pen, I knew." Mercer looked at Ranger. He remembered. He never gave up. Ellie stepped forward, placing several printed files on the hay bale beside the recorder. These matched the locations he mentioned. The cave, the smuggling route. Even the call logs from the SAR radio channel scrubbed the same week Jonah disappeared. Mercer looked at the device. "You have what you need now. You don't need me." Arthur stared at him for a long moment, then said quietly, "We do. You're the only one who can prove the boy's voice was stolen." Mercer lowered his head. "Then let them hear me say it." He turned back toward the recorder, and his next words came sharp and clear. "My name is Daniel Mercer. I worked as operations liaison under the Mason County Search and Rescue Initiative, cross-assigned with the MCS Shadow Division. I confirmed that a child, Jonah Reese, was alive when the search was ended, and I knowingly participated in the concealment of his location due to external pressure from Blake Winston and associated interests. I confessed to falsifying reports, violating duty, and knowingly endangering the life of a minor." His voice broke slightly. "But I also confirm the boy lived. The dog knew, and the truth never died." Hank clicked off the recorder. The barn exhaled, And for the first time in 7 years, the story was no longer Jonah's burden alone. It was on tape. It was real. It would be heard. The sheriff's station had never seen a surrender like this. No shouting, no lawyers, no cuffs slapped in fury, just a man walking through the front door with his past folded neatly in an envelope and a dog's gaze burning between his shoulder blades like a final judgment. Mercer stood at the counter. One hand held a small duffel. The other rested flat on the file folder. No badge, no excuses. Behind the glass, Deputy Klein looked up, startled. "Can I help you?" Mercer nodded once. "You can start with calling the State Bureau. Tell them Dan Mercer's here to confess." He slid the folder forward. Inside the taped confession, a copy of Ellie's GPS-tagged search logs, and 3 photos of the cave mouth Jonah had called home for too long. Klein blinked. "Wait, Dan Mercer," as in, "I'll wait in the holding cell," Mercer interrupted. "Don't lose that file." And then he turned himself in. Back in Hollow Valley, Ellie stood in the doorway of a modest newspaper office that still smelled like ink and stubbornness. The Mason County Tribune wasn't much for people. A single-column layout, no digital archive, but it had one thing bigger outlets didn't. Judith Granger, former Pulitzer finalist, resigned after refusing to bury a story on contractor fraud, now ran the paper like it was her second soul. "You're early," Judith said, pulling open the door. Ellie didn't speak. She just handed over the thick envelope. Judith opened it slowly. Her breath caught on the second page. She looked up. "Is this real?" Ellie's voice was firm. "It's more than real. It's about to explode." Judith's eyes darted across the time stamps, the names, the transcript from Mercer's confession. Then she stopped at the photo, a boy with sunken cheeks and a carved wooden dog in his lap. She touched the image like it was ash from a long-dead fire. "His name is Jonah," Ellie said, "and he's alive." Judith nodded once. "Then we'd better make sure the world knows." By sundown, it had begun. The Tribune ran the first exclusive, but the story didn't stay local. A trusted friend in public radio picked it up. From there, it caught in the feed of a journalist at KMN News in Chicago, then ricocheted through a dozen freelance networks and community boards. Hashtags sprouted like wildflowers in spring. So that's justice. For Jonah, the dog who remembered, Mercer confesses, Mason County truth. People shared the image of Ranger stoic, scarred, loyal, sitting in front of the farmhouse with Jonah's hand resting gently on his back. A child who'd been invisible, a dog who refused to forget. Meanwhile, Jonah stayed hidden at Arthur's farm. He didn't need to speak, not yet. His story was already shouting across the country. But one evening, as the sky bled lavender over the fields, he walked into the barn with a marker in his hand. Quiet, focused. He found an old support beam and began to write, not big, not loud, just enough. "I wasn't lost. I was silenced. And now I remember." Arthur saw it the next morning, said nothing. Just stood there with his coffee going cold and his eyes a little too wet to blame on the wind. And as headlines broke open, cities, offices, and lies, the echo returned to where it began. Not in the courtroom, not in the news feed, but in the breath of a boy and the bark of a dog who never stopped trying. The broadcast didn't begin with a headline. It began with a photo, a grainy, wind-washed image of an aging German shepherd sitting beneath a rusted porch light head, raised, ears soft. One paw resting against the boot of a boy who wasn't supposed to exist, Ranger and Jonah. The screen held that frame for a full 5 seconds before the voiceover began. This is the story Mason County tried to forget. This is the boy who vanished, and this is the dog who remembered. The WLMN Evening News wasn't known for viral journalism, but that night, across half the Midwest, television sets flickered awake with a story that didn't scream. It trembled, soft, steady, unavoidable. It cut from photos to drone footage of the ridge, from old SAR files with redacted lines to Ellie's trembling hands holding a weathered map, from Hank Donovan's interview at his back porch, cigarette untouched in the ashtray, to a still from Dan Mercer's video confession. But it was the clip of Jonah that silenced everything. Just 3 seconds, him stepping out of the cave, him whispering a name, Ranger. The moment the dog whined and pressed against the boy's side, the newsroom fell quiet. Even the audio team forgot to cue the next segment. By the time the broadcast ended, the internet had already devoured it. Hashtags trended before the anchors signed off. Local sheriff lines jammed. Lawmakers were tagged in thousands of retweets demanding investigations. And somewhere, deep inside a penthouse office lined with plaques and closed-door secrets, Blake Winston's phone would not stop ringing. People didn't just want answers. They wanted reckoning. But back in Hollow Valley, the world remained still. Arthur stood on his porch as the segment ended, the blue glow of the television still flickering through his front window. His hand hovered at the back of Ranger's neck, fingers buried in that coarse, weather-worn fur. The old dog didn't move. He didn't need to, because his work, his truth, had finally found its voice. Jonah sat nearby on the porch steps, wrapped in a blanket, knees hugged to his chest. He wasn't watching the screen. He was watching the stars, mouth slightly open like he was hearing something he hadn't dared hope for. Silence without fear, freedom without running. And across counties, cities, and states, Ranger's image became a symbol of the child not forgotten, of the justice not denied, of a loyalty not measured by barks or commands, but by the footsteps a dog takes long after everyone else turns away. It didn't take long. By morning, the county website had crashed. By noon, state investigators were on the phone. And by sunset, Blake Winston had vanished. No press release, no resignation. Just a silent recusal wrapped in a family emergency memo circulated through trembling hands. But no one was fooled. The broadcast had lit a fuse, and what followed wasn't a spark, it was a wildfire. The Mason County Courthouse, normally a place of traffic fines and dusty land deeds, was surrounded by reporters for the first time in decades. A sea of microphones and eyes turned to any official who dared step outside. Inside, the records department worked late into the night reopening sealed logs, search dispatch transcripts, email archives. The deeper they looked, the worse it got. Because the truth wasn't just hidden, it had been systematically buried. Old SAR members were the first to speak. Not all, but enough. Some came in with their heads bowed, hats clutched to chests, like they were stepping into confession. Others walked in angry, not at the boy, not at the dog, but at themselves. For what they'd been told, for what they'd ignored, for what they chose not to question when the search was abruptly shut down all those years ago. "I remember that ridge," one man said on local radio. "I remember Dan Mercer wanting to go back, even after the feds told us to stand down. I thought he was chasing ghosts." He paused. "And I guess he was. But ghosts don't carve wooden dogs. Ghosts don't bleed in caves. Ghosts don't whisper your name when no one else is listening." The confession Mercer had recorded became part of a larger investigation. Within 48 hours, the governor's office announced the launch of an independent task force to review all child disappearance cases handled by the disbanded MCS unit. Winston's name surfaced again, not just in this case, but in 3 others. Contracts signed off, reports manipulated, budgets rerouted to private contractors with no oversight. His office released a statement denying involvement, blaming rogue officers, calling it a tragic miscommunication in an otherwise cooperative search effort. But it was too late. Documents don't lie. Boys don't survive alone for 7 years, and dogs don't dig unless something's still buried. Back at Hollow Valley, Jonah stayed off the grid. Ellie monitored media. Hank worked the phones, and Arthur just watched the porch day after day, watching the wind, the road, the quiet way Ranger never stopped listening. Once, Jonah came to him holding a newspaper, one that had Ranger's picture on the front. The headline read, "The Dog Who Never Forgot." He didn't say anything, just showed Arthur the paper, and then hugged him from the side, his head against the farmer's shoulder. Arthur didn't cry, but he did sit down afterward, alone in the barn, and stare at a broken shovel for nearly an hour, because sometimes silence is heavier than grief, and sometimes the loudest uproars come from the things that were quiet for too long. The envelope was hand-addressed, no return label, just careful, almost trembling handwriting across the front, to Jonah Reese, care of Arthur Langley. Arthur found it tucked beneath the cracked wood of the front gate, where the wind couldn't catch it, but where eyes might. He stared at it for a long moment, reluctant to open something that had traveled years and grief to get there. He placed it on the kitchen table without a word. Jonah found it hours later. He didn't touch it at first, just looked, as if the sight of his name, written by her, might undo whatever fragile stitching had held him together this long. Arthur gave him space. Eventually, the boy opened it with slow fingers, unfolding the single sheet of soft ivory paper. The handwriting matched the envelope, elegant, shaking. "My dearest Jonah, I don't know where to begin, and I don't deserve to ask anything of you, but I need to see you, even just once. I've spent every day of the last 7 years hoping you were alive, and every night fearing I was wrong. I haven't been back to Hollow Valley since the funeral they held without you. But now I hear you're safe, and that there was someone, a dog, who never gave up on you. I don't want to disrupt anything. I just want to sit with you, listen to you if you want to speak, or just be near if you don't. Please, Jonah, I am still your mother. Love, Mom." Jonah didn't cry, but his hand stayed clenched around the letter for a long time after reading it. He didn't say yes. He didn't say no. That night, he left the note on Arthur's workbench beside the lantern, an old tin of nails. And in the morning, Arthur started preparing the house. He swept the porch twice, not because it was dusty, though it was, but because he wasn't sure what else to do. He laid out clean cushions, moved the old rocking chair to face the ridge, wiped down the table near the window where Jonah liked to draw. He even found an old photo Jonah had once glanced at but never asked about, Lily, arms around a younger, chubbier version of her son, standing near a lake. Arthur placed it by the window, not as a reminder, as a bridge. Ranger lay nearby, watching everything but not moving much. He seemed to understand, in that way old dogs do, that something sacred was coming, and all that was required now was stillness. The sun hadn't cleared the ridge yet when the car pulled in. It was a modest sedan, faded blue with a slight dent in the seat like it had weathered just enough road to carry sorrow, but not break from it. Lily stepped out. She looked older than the last photo Arthur had seen, but not weaker. There was something in her posture, something in the way she clutched her coat and looked up at the house. A kind of fragile defiance, like a woman who had schemed into the dark for too long and didn't quite believe the dawn had finally answered. Arthur met her at the gate. He didn't speak, just nodded, then stepped aside. Jonah was standing in the doorway. He didn't run, didn't hide. He just stood shoulders square, smaller than he'd once been, but somehow more whole than anyone expected. Lily froze when she saw him, and then, without hesitation, she stepped forward and knelt at the porch steps, arms open, but not demanding. "Hi, baby," she whispered. Her voice broke on the last syllable. Jonah took one breath, then another, then he walked forward, eyes never leaving hers. And for the first time in 7 years, he let himself fall into his mother's arms. There were no cameras, no news vans, no flashing headlines. Just a porch, a boy, a mother, and a dog who never moved, never barked, just closed his eyes and rested his head against the wood. Because some reunions don't need words. They only need someone to come home. The morning came without thunder or song. Just a soft light slanting through the pine trees and the sound of dew letting go, drop by drop from the porch rafters above. Lily hadn't left. She'd slept in the spare room, if sleep could even be called what she'd done, eyes open more often than closed, listening for footsteps in the hallway, for the creak of Jonah's door, for anything that reminded her this wasn't just a dream painted over grief. Jonah hadn't said much the night before, but he hadn't run either, and somehow that said more. Now they stood on the porch together, no words, just presence. Jonah was still thin. His frame seemed built from too many winters and not enough warmth. But his hands no longer trembled when he reached for the railing. He leaned against it beside her, their arms just inches apart. Lily didn't press, didn't push. She simply turned her hand palm up between them. And slowly like, the trust had to thaw its way through 7 years of absence. Jonah's fingers found hers, their hands laced in silence, not the silence of strangers, but the silence of people who had lost everything and somehow still found a piece of each other again. Ranger lay just a few feet away, chin resting on his crossed paws, ears alert but soft. His fur, dusted with silver, shimmered in the morning light like frost, clinging to old timber. Every so often, his tail would thump against the porch once, twice, soft, steady like a heartbeat that never gave up. Arthur watched from the screen door. He didn't say anything either. He just leaned one hand against the frame and breathed in the moment like someone who had forgotten what peace felt like and was afraid it might vanish if he blinked too long. Lily eventually broke the silence, not with a question, but a whisper. "Do you remember the time we went to Willow Lake? You had a red bucket, and you made me throw pebbles in so you could train the fish." Jonah gave a small exhale. It wasn't quite a laugh, but it wasn't pain either. "I thought they liked routines," he said softly. "Same time, same splash." Lily smiled, wiping the corner of her eye, not from tears, but from habit. "You were always a boy who believed in patterns." "I still am," he said. She looked at him. "And what do you believe now?" Jonah looked down at Ranger, at the scar on his flank, at the old collar, half torn, but worn like a badge, at the dog who had remembered what no one else dared. "I believe," he said slowly, "some things are meant to find their way back, no matter how far they get lost." Later they shared toast by the fire. The three of them. Jonah sat cross-legged on the floor, scribbling something into the journal Arthur had given him. A habit now, one he used like breath, not for others, but for himself. Lily sipped coffee in the same spot she once used to rock him to sleep. Ranger curled up by the hearth, letting out one long sigh that sounded like it carried years of waiting, and the household battered, filled with echoes, felt just a little less hollow, just a little more whole. The call came at dusk. Hank Donovan was sitting in his truck, parked halfway up Echo Ridge, the signal better up here than down in the valley. He'd just finished scribbling notes in a spiral pad things Ellie had said the day before, cross-referenced with old OR reports, memories that still refused to fade. The number was unfamiliar, Washington area code. He answered with caution in his voice. "Donovan." A pause, then a woman spoke, measured, clear. "Government." "Mr. Donovan, my name is Aaron Lowe. I'm with the State Investigations Office. Your name came up during a secondary audit on sealed ASAR files, specifically those connected to the MCS task force and the 26 Jonah Reese case. The name alone made Hank's grip tighten on the wheel. "I'm listening," she continued. "We've just unsealed a supplemental archive, unofficially referred to as the Phantom Archive. It wasn't listed under state property. It was found among flagged items from a deceased official's estate, boxed in a private storage unit near Pike County." Hank's heart beat slower now. Not calmer, just heavier. Inside the file, she explained, were a few things. Memos, a handwritten inventory, surveillance sketches, and one particular item, a hand-drawn topographic map. Coordinates had been penciled in, trails marked in red, and one symbol in blue ink, a crescent drawn above a jagged rock line. She described it exactly, and Hank knew without a doubt it was the cave, the very one where they found Jonah. "You're saying someone knew," Hank said, voice low. "Yes," Aaron answered, a pause on the other end. "And chose not to act. Do you have a name?" There was hesitation, the kind that usually precedes consequence. "Not yet," she said. The file was unsigned, but the handwriting has been submitted for analysis. Early comparisons suggest It may match someone previously within the command chain of the Mason County Search and Rescue Privatized Oversight Board. Hank felt his stomach turn, not because it was a surprise, but because part of him already knew. That night, Hank sat with Arthur on the porch. Jonah and Lily were inside, lights low, music playing soft on the old radio something from a time before any of this ever happened. Ranger lay at Hank's feet, one ear twitching now and then, eyes half closed. Arthur passed him a cup of black coffee, steam curling like ghost stories in the night. "They found something?" Arthur asked. Hank nodded. "File was real. They buried it. On purpose." Arthur's jaw clenched, but he didn't say anything, only watched the moon. "And the cave?" he added, after a pause. Hank looked out at the trees, the faint trailhead still visible under silver light. "Marked on the map, same coordinates, same terrain lines. Someone knew where Jonah was and left him there." Silence hung between them like smoke. Inside the file had also been a final page, not a report, not data. Just 4 words scribbled in faded black ink, half crossed out and nearly torn through from pressure. He saw too much. There was no signature, but there didn't need to be. The truth had weight of its own. And now, with the page turned and the name near exposure, there was only one thing left to do. Let the silence end. The sun was melting behind the ridge, spreading honeyed gold over the rusted fence posts and dry grass. Hollow Valley, for the first time in a long time, breathed quietly, like even the land knew the storm had passed, at least for tonight. A fire crackled in the pit behind Arthur's barn. The flames were small, intentional, just enough to cast long, slow shadows against the timber walls. Arthur, Hank, and Ellie sat around it in silence. There were no reporters, no phones buzzing, no statements to issue. Just the sound of wood settling in flame and the low whistle of a breeze drifting down from the ridge. Jonah sat closest to the fire, knees tucked in, chin resting on his arms. He wasn't speaking, but his stillness no longer felt like fear. It felt like arrival. Max lay curled just behind him, chest rising slow and steady, his eyes half-lidded in peace. Occasionally he would nudge closer until his flank pressed gently against Jonah's back. A quiet reminder. I'm here, I've always been. Ellie passed around chipped mugs of cider, her hands trembling only slightly, part nerves, part relief. She was the last one standing from a search that had once defined her and nearly ruined her. "You ever think we'd see this day?" she asked, not expecting an answer. Arthur didn't reply right away. He just poked the fire with an old branch, eyes tracking the embers like they were memories, trying to escape the wood. "It's not the day I imagined," he said eventually, "but maybe it's the one we needed." Hank nodded, leaning back on an overturned crate, hat tipped low against the smoke. "No justice ever feels clean," he muttered, "but it's better than silence." Jonah turned to them then, not fully, but enough for his voice to carry across the flames. He never stopped looking. They all yawned. He was staring at Max, not as a pet, not even just as a hero, but as something far deeper, as if the dog had carried a thread of his soul through 7 winters and returned it without asking for anything in return. Ellie set her mug down and knelt beside him. "He led us back to you," she said. When everything else failed. Jonah reached down and gently scratched the gray behind Max's ears. The dog didn't move, only gave a low, satisfied sigh. I used to talk to him, Jonah whispered, when I was scared. I thought maybe he was a ghost, a dream, but he came anyway. Arthur glanced at the horizon, the last sliver of sun bleeding out behind the trees. He thought of all the years he'd spent in silence, of the decision to buy a dog no one wanted, of that first night on the porch when neither of them said a word. We don't need to know what's next, Arthur said. Not tonight. Jonah nodded, and for the first time he smiled. It was small, crooked, fragile, but real. Later, as the stars came out and the fire burned down to soft orange coals, they stayed in that circle. No speeches, no promises, just presence. 4 souls and 1 faithful dog, resting in a quiet pact made not with words, but with shared survival. And in the stillness, in the whisper between the crackles, there was peace. It didn't happen all at once. There was no parade, no red carpet, no made-for-TV moment to mark Jonah's return. It started with a photo one snapped without permission, but shared with reverence. Jonah, half smiling, sitting cross-legged on the porch, and Ranger lying beside him, muzzle gray, eyes closed, one paw resting gently over the boy's boot. The caption read simply, "The Dog Who Remembered." And that was all it took. The story spread like a wind-borne fire across the valley, through the county, then the state, and eventually national morning shows picked it up. But not the sensational kind. These weren't the flashing tabloid headlines of fear or scandal. They were quieter. Lost boy, loyal dog, a 7-year silence broken. Jonah's name became synonymous with survival, but not the kind people shouted about. It was the quiet kind, the kind that breathes beneath trauma, that doesn't ask for spotlight but deserves every beam of it. Offers came in, of course, magazine features, speaking circuits. A book deal floated through Ellie's inbox. One producer even suggested adapting it into a film something, about the emotional arc being perfectly cinematic. Arthur read that email and closed the laptop without responding. He knew what they wanted: the pain, the mystery, the boy's tears, the dog's sacrifice packaged neatly between commercial breaks. But Jonah wasn't a product, and Ranger wasn't a prop. Instead, Arthur let the world move as it pleased. He refused interviews, not out of anger, but reverence. Some stories belonged to the land they happened on, to the fire pit, to the people who lived them. Ranger still slept on the same porch. He still woke early, walked the fence line, lay under the oak tree where Jonah sometimes sat sketching quietly in his notebook. They were both older now, bent slightly by what they'd endured, but not broken, just real. Occasionally, a car would pull up by the gate. Strangers, holding cameras or carrying hopeful letters. Arthur would walk down the drive, polite but firm. "This place isn't a museum," he'd say gently. "It's a home." If they persisted, Max would rise from the porch and stare, not threatening, just enough to make clear the boy had already been found. He didn't need to be chased again. Once a month, Jonah would visit the local community center with Ellie, not to speak, he wasn't ready for that, but to sit among the other kids from rough places. He didn't say much, but when they saw him, they sat straighter, listened harder, because he had come back from where most don't. because the dog beside him hadn't let the world forget. The world had many names for what happened: a miracle, a tragedy undone, a lesson in human resilience. But Arthur preferred something simpler. He called it grace. And as long as Ranger rested his tired body beside that boy, no medal, no plaque, no camera flash could ever define the deeper truth. They found each other, and neither one ever let go. The oak stood like it always had, ancient, wide-limbed, and quiet as a prayer that never asked to be heard. It had watched seasons pass, like slow-breathing animals, leaves shedding and growing again, snow softening its roots, and summer sunlight filtering through its crown. And beneath it, Jonah sat, cross-legged, notebook on his lap, pen moving slowly, not with urgency, but intention. Each letter pressed like it mattered, as though he was writing not to explain, but to understand. Ranger lay beside him, as he always did, head on his paws, ears slightly tilted, half listening, half resting. The kind of stillness only earned by years spent searching for things no one else believed were still out there. Arthur stood a little ways back, arms folded, not wanting to interrupt. He'd brought up a thermos of cocoa like he used to when Jonah first returned, though now the boy rarely touched it. Still, some rituals stayed, even when they were no longer needed. Eventually, Jonah closed the notebook, but not before Arthur caught a glimpse of the final line. The ink was still drying. A boy lost, a dog who remembered, a truth too loud for silence. Arthur blinked once, twice, and then looked away because the sting in his eyes wasn't from the wind. He sat down beside Jonah, slow from years and heavier thoughts. Neither spoke for a long time. It wasn't it's born of absence. It was the kind that comes when everything has finally landed where it belongs. After a while, Arthur asked softly, "That your ending?" Jonah shook his head. "It's the beginning." He opened the notebook again, flipping past the pages, drawings of rangers sniffing near tree roots, of the cave's outline, of the little carved dog left behind near the shelter, symbols only he would understand, memories not drawn to share, but to keep. "I used to think I forgot how to talk," Jonah said. Arthur waited, but it wasn't forgetting. It was choosing. Some things didn't deserve to be spoken, not until now. His voice didn't waver. It just existed, like it had been in hiding, waiting for permission. "You don't owe the world anything," Arthur said after a moment. "I know," Jonah replied, "but maybe someone else out there needs to hear it. Maybe someone else is still lost and waiting for a dog like Ranger." Down the ridge, the valley glowed with end-of-day light. The wheat fields shimmered gold. A hawk circled above. Somewhere near the barn, Max barked once, then quieted, satisfied. Jonah leaned back against the oak, fingers still brushing the journal's spine. Arthur placed a hand on his shoulder. "You found your voice, son?" "No," Jonah answered. His gaze moved to Ranger, who was now watching the horizon, not quite asleep, not quite alert, just listening. "I found his." The light was different that evening, not just golden, but forgiving. The kind of light that didn't just touch surfaces, but sank in, warming the coldest edges of things long buried. It spilled over the hills of Hollow Valley like it had been waiting like the sun itself had paused to witness something small but sacred. Arthur stood at the porch railing, coffee in hand gone cold. He didn't sip it anymore. He only held it, like a habit he hadn't outgrown. The porch creaked under his boots as he leaned forward, watching. Jonah walked ahead, quiet footsteps, trailing through the amber-streaked field. His frame was still thin, but stronger now. Shoulders not curled inward, eyes lifted. Each step seemed to loosen something invisible, like the boy was finally making room for the man he might one day become. And beside him, Ranger. Old, steady, gray in the face, but still moving with the kind of purpose only dogs like him could hold. His gait was slower now, but his head remained level, eyes scanning ahead like he was still guarding a perimeter no one else could see. They didn't talk. They didn't need to. Arthur watched the two figures from a distance, just silhouettes in the golden swell of the land. But somehow it felt like the clearest conversation ever had, not in words, but in presence, in trust, in direction. Somewhere behind him, the house creaked. A breeze lifted the curtains. The journal Jonah had left behind on the windowsill was open again. Arthur had reread that final line so many times the ink felt carved into his memory. A boy lost, a dog who remembered, a truth too loud for silence. But now, watching them walk, he realized that line wasn't where the story ended, it was where the burden was finally set down. They reached the fence line. Jonah paused, hand resting gently on the weathered wood. Ranger stopped too, looking back for the briefest second, just long enough for their eyes to meet. Arthur lifted his hand. The boy nodded. The dog's tail gave one soft sway, and then they kept walking, toward the glow, toward the open pasture where stories didn't need telling anymore, where silence didn't mean sorrow, and where the past, however painful, could finally stop chasing. In that final light, Hollow Valley wasn't just a forgotten place on a map. It was a beginning, a reborn, a dog redeemed, and a world made softer, simply because one didn't give up on the other. They walked forward, not toward the past, but into whatever future they chose together. In a world that often forgets the quiet heroes, Ranger reminds us that loyalty doesn't fade with time, and some hearts never stop searching. This wasn't just the story of a boy found. It was the story of a bond that refused to be broken, of a dog who remembered when everyone else forgot, and of a man who gave both a place to come home to. German shepherds like Ranger aren't just working dogs. They are guardians of truth, protectors of memory, and companions who walk beside us long after the path has grown cold. They don't ask for medals. They only ask to matter. Let this be more than a story. Let it be a reminder that healing takes time, that kindness is never wasted, and that sometimes the strongest light comes from those who've walked through the deepest dark. If this touched your heart, honor it. Love an animal. Trust their instincts. And never underestimate what one loyal soul can do, because sometimes a dog doesn't just save a life, he gives it back.